operate a young queen that has a strong QMP when feeding. This large retinue then passes around the hormone all throughout the hive when they travel, when workers groom each other, and through trophallaxis. That's where bees feed each other mouth to mouth. The higher the concentration of the queen mandibular pheromone in a colony, the stronger the colony. If a poor quality queen has less than ideal amount of queen mandibular pheromone, then she'll have a smaller retinue, and a smaller amount of QMP is distributed throughout the colony. Smaller amounts of queen mandibular pheromone weakens the colony. So if the QMP diminishes enough, you can end up with a colony of laying workers. Workers will also begin rearing queens and supersedure cells, and the colony will have lower productivity overall. Beekeepers should keep track of your queen's age. Mark them. Clip the queen's wings so you know how old she is and keep records. Also, replace your queens at least every 2 years with queens from a reliable source that you know will have the best chance of being quality queens. Let's look at genetics and how it relates to quality queens. Good quality queens come from healthy, high-quality queens that are well mated with genetically diverse drones. Going deeper, we note that a good, healthy queen should also have been bred for hygienic traits. A hygienic queen will produce hygienic offspring who can reduce stressors in the hive, which results in a stronger, healthier colony. If a queen experiences inbreeding, this causes her to produce diploid drones. Diploid drones are blondish colored and they have very light eyes. They're not viable and their sisters will eat them. If they're not eaten, then they end up dying prematurely. And too many diploid drones causes a shotgun brood pattern. So if you see a shotgun brood pattern and you can't find a cause based on disease, you may have a highly inbred colony. Inbred colonies are weaker than genetically diverse colonies, so ensure your queen is well mated.
It is, isn't it?
What about the drones? Healthy colonies produce thousands of drones if the colony is large enough and if environmental conditions are right. Drone emergence and queen mating flights coincide. Drones form all of their sperm prior to emerging, but upon merging, they have to wait about 12 days before their sperm migrates to the seminal vesicles. At this point, he's sexually mature and has about 10 million spermatozoa. And he'll go on multiple mating flights a day. He'll frequently come back to the hive to refuel and go back out again to what's called drone congregation areas, or DCAs. That's where he waits with other drones for virgin queens to fly by on their mating flights. When he spots a virgin queen and is able to mate with her, he will invert his phallus and his endophallus stays inside the queen. That's known as the mating sign. Now, every drone provides less than 1 million spermatozoa to a spermatheca. Now, besides diploid drones from inbred colonies, what else can affect a drone's ability to mate well with a virgin queen? Pesticides. Studies have found that sperm viability dramatically drops in drones raised on frames that were lightly coated with miticides and agricultural pesticides. For example, on frames that were coated with fluvalinate and coumaphos, the sperm was only 30% viable. That means that out of all the sperm in the drone, only 30% of it was alive, as opposed to control group drones, which had 100% viable sperm. With amitraz, viability was at 80%. With chlorothalonil and chlorpyrifos, viability was at 40%. Mating conditions can affect queen quality. If there aren't enough sexually mature drones where she goes to mate, then the queen will be undermated and will not have a spermatheca full of diverse sperm. She will run out of sperm, and that will cause her to prematurely fail at laying eggs. So what can beekeepers do? Well, keep your drones healthy by changing out your frames every 2 years to reduce contaminants. Ensure that you aren't causing inbreeding. Be knowledgeable about the apiaries around you. So if you're rearing queens, then you're aware if there are enough drones in the area for mating. And be aware that if you live in an area where Africanized feral bee colonies reside, if you allow your virgin queens to go out and mate, then the sperm she acquires is likely to be Africanized. We have seen how pesticides can affect drones, but can they also affect queens? Studies on pesticides and queen rearing found a dramatic drop in eggs laid by queens raised in pesticide-laden wax. Let's also look at habitat fragmentation. Now, urbanization, or the building of housing developments and commercial districts, can wipe out a lot of native wild plant life. This creates food deserts, which reduce the quantity and quality of food availability. Now, climate change has a powerful impact on the behavior of plants and flowers. Climate change has been shown to cause early flowering and change the distribution of entire floral species. Changes in weather patterns can affect pollen and nectar availability, and also the quantity and quality of pollen and nectar. A change in food availability can weaken a colony's immune system, or even cause death by starvation. Finally, an interesting temperature study showed that during the transit of packaged bees, the packages experience a variable range of temperatures not normally experienced by a colony. Now, this fluctuation in temperature can negatively affect the quality of the queen. To help avoid this problem, try to obtain your bee packages locally.
Every year, farms and fields play host to a symphony of sorts. Pollination, the springtime syncopation of flowering plants and the animals who feast on the nectar and pollen they produce. Over millennia, pollinators like honeybees have evolved a well-timed dance with plants. But now, plants may be changing their tune. Spring green-up, when plants wake from winter and sprout leaves. It's such a global phenomenon that NASA satellites can see it from space. Sensors, such as MODIS on NASA's Aqua and Terra satellites, can show us how green our planet is throughout the year, and they've captured something strange. In the northern U.S., spring green-up is starting about a half day earlier each year. The likely cause? Our warming climate. But is pollination also moving earlier? The images can't detect individual flowers, so scientists have been left to guess, until now. NASA research scientist Wayne Isaias spearheads a special team gathering data directly in the field. They're the honeybees in his Maryland backyard.
Honeybees are great data collectors for understanding processes of pollination. Bees fly 2.5 miles in all directions to scout for bee forage and bring back pollen and nectar. And so therefore they sample a very large range of environments.
By weighing the hives, Wayne can detect when nectar peaks and ebbs each year.
During the winter, the hive loses weight as they eat the honey to feed the babies and keep warm. And then when plants start blooming in abundance, the hive starts gaining weight. It can gain a tremendous amount of weight. I've had a hive gain 25 pounds in one day.
Wayne's been keeping tabs on his bees for less than 20 years. But in that time, pollination has moved more than 10 days earlier.
That's completely in sync with what the satellite data record shows, the world here getting greener earlier in the spring by about a half a day a year. If we have a few scale hive measurements with the wall-to-wall coverage of the satellite, we can then extrapolate the scale hive measurements of when the nectar flows occur to very large areas of the country.
Now, to get a bee's eye perspective of how pollination is changing in very different environments, say deserts or mountains, Wayne's doing a little networking.
HoneyBeeNet is a network of citizen scientist beekeepers that volunteered to weigh their hives to give us more data points, to see how the nectar flows are changing in all different parts of the country.
If pollination dates keep creeping forward, plants and pollinators could move out of sync. Currently, young bees are able to grow and get out on the hunt by the time plants bloom. But if plants bloom before bees are ready, both miss out. The plants don't get pollinated and the bees go hungry. But more than just bees might miss a meal. NASA satellites can help us understand how climate change might affect what's on our dinner table.
Modern agriculture requires bees as part of the production. It's as mandatory for food production as is pieces of irrigation pipe and fuel for tractors. So if we're to understand the impact of climate change on our ecosystems, we must understand how this plant-pollinator interaction is being impacted by climate change.
Let's look at how pathogens and pests can affect queens and queen quality. Now, Varroa destructor feeds on fat bodies and hemolymph, on a vector of several bee viruses that are transmitted to drones, workers, and queens. Queens can get the deformed wing virus. They also can get the black queen cell virus, where affected queens don't emerge, they're blackish, and they're removed by workers. Now, Nosema cerana is a gut pathogen that creates digestive issues like dysentery, and it can affect queens. There's more stress in a colony due to Nosema infection, and the quality of the queen mandibular pheromone changes significantly in queens affected with Nosema cerana. It makes the queen smell differently, and the workers are less attracted to the queen, which causes a significant drop in the distribution of the queen mandibular pheromone in the colony. Queen nutrition is important and affects the quality of the queen and the colony as a whole. Humans can't live off hamburgers. We need diversity in our diet, and the same goes for honeybees. Consuming the same pollen source is bad for bees. They need pollen diversity to be healthy. Now, a study in 2010 found that dietary protein diversity, known as polyfloral pollen, has a direct impact on immunocompetence. Polyfloral diets boost colony immunity, and queens who consume diverse natural pollen have been found to lay more eggs than queens who have consumed pollen patties. Queens were also found to have a larger queen mandibular gland if fed diverse pollen rather than just pollen patties. And beekeepers should plant pollinator seed mixes to introduce a variety of pollen to their honeybees, and then save pollen patties as a booster rather than a regular protein source for your colonies. Let's take a look at our beekeeping practices. If we don't keep track of our queens and care for them properly, we're inviting swarming, supersedure, drone-laying queens, and laying workers. Ultimately, by ignoring our queens, we ignore our colonies, and ignored colonies will weaken and die. Laying worker drones are inferior to drones from quality queens. The traits of laying worker drones are greatly inferior to queen drone brood. If we have a laying worker colony and ignore it, then we're introducing tons of inferior drones into the environment, which will end up mating with queens from your neighboring beekeepers. So don't ignore your colonies or their problems, because that affects everyone around you. Now, all the factors in this presentation are reasons why premature queen supersedure in the U.S. is relatively common. Supersedure is what happens when a colony decides to replace the reigning queen with a new queen. They do this when they sense that the current queen is no longer a quality queen. So to help keep your colonies healthy, requeen every 1 to 2 years. You'll end up with a higher colony population and more honey. Also, your colonies will be less likely to swarm. Thank you. We hope you've enjoyed our presentation on queen quality. You can dive deeper into the subject of queen quality by searching for published online studies that are available on the web. Use the search terms honeybee queen study. Thank you and happy beekeeping.
Okay, surely some of you are going to have some questions. Was it too much? Overwhelm you? Part of the strategy of the mating is that the queen rarely goes, well, the drones rarely go more than a half mile from home, and the queen is going to go farther before she turns on a pheromone to attract the drones. And then the drone congregation group sniff that pheromone, and their eyesight, they can pinpoint her at a distance and they go after her. In the old days, there were bees out in the woods, and they were scattered around enough that we used to, if we had a hive that did not have a queen, we could give them a frame of brood, and they would get a queen hatch. She would mate, and over a couple months' time, in the end of the summer, they would reestablish, build their population, and make it through the winter. Now that's hard to do, very difficult, low percentages.
So where
We
did
have-
the bees congregate, BJ? Where did the drones congregate while they're waiting? Treetops?
There's an elevation that they choose, but they choose geographic features to locate around. For example, if there was a hayfield or a horse pasture and mature pine trees in the plot next door, that would be a geographic feature. The problem in Georgia is you take 5 steps and you've got another geographic feature. You picture Kansas and Nebraska with a dry wash area that fills up when they have a hard rain, and they've got a little scrub bush there that's 4 foot tall. In Nebraska and Kansas, that would be a geographic feature. It would be totally different from anything surrounding it. In other areas, you could kind of predict where the drones would go. Up in the mountains, they're more likely to go up or down a valley rather than over the ridge. If they're up on the side of the mountain, they're probably more likely to go down the mountain than to go up the mountain. But it's pretty hard to predict the queens because they go farther, and so there's that much bigger of an area for them to cover.
Hey, BJ, there was some mention of pesticides and their effect on the queen, but I'm just wondering, is there also a similar effect or some kind of effect from herbicides? Because I noticed a decline in my hives after treating some poison ivy around my hives.
Herbicides and fungicides will tend to affect the pollen and the larva more than the adult bees. If it kills the adult bees and kills them out in the field, that's a good thing because they don't have a chance to bring anything back to the hive that's contaminated. And
Yeah, so this was close by. So
yeah, one of the prime examples of the drones being affected by the insecticide, chemical insecticide, was Hawaii when they acquired the varroa mites. The State Department of Ag came out with a requirement that the queen shippers certify that they were below a certain level of infestation with the mites. They didn't have to be 100% clear, which is near impossible, but they had to certify. And so everybody went to treating, and they'd never had to treat for varroa mites before. And some of the treatments that we have approved for varroa mites diminish the sperm. And so the queens were mated, but the sperm was not viable. And so one of three things was happening in my hives that year. This was probably 10, 12 years ago. One, they would keep trying to force the queen to go out and mate because she didn't have the pheromones. And in some cases, she would be killed by the bees, forcing her to go out and mate. In some cases, the queen was still there, but she was not laying, or the bees were cleaning the infertile eggs out 100%. And the third case was that she would start laying infertile eggs and be a drone layer. And this was pretty hard on the industry that spring. And what happened is the longer time went past from the time the drones were medicated, and as the volume increased in a way, the problem diminished. Joe Latshaw, I actually called him and told him what we were having as an issue, and he called beekeepers that he knew had gotten queens from Hawaii down in Florida, which would be early to mid-January, and he was able to get samples of queens from them that were staged out progressively through the month of January, and he could identify queens that were mated, but the semen was not viable, and he could see it start to change to where a higher percentage was good in the queens. So it's a very real thing.
BJ,
Yes,
what can we do to, I guess, make sure we're getting our queens from a quality source? Because I'm starting more hives this year, and I don't want to get stuck with bad queens later on down the road.
Mm-hmm. To have well-mated queens, you have to have a plan for drones. What I do is set up the queen yard in one central location, and I just basically take a compass and draw a half-mile radius circle on a map. And then I draw another circle that's a mile and a quarter out. And I want to put at least 6 bee yards near that circle that's out there a mile and a quarter. The idea being that every time I have a bee yard out there, they're going to range out a half a mile. Now, I can't guarantee that they're going to range out in 4 different directions a half mile, but at least I'm making an attempt to have a high volume of drones out there. High population hives for the drones. You're getting the idea that it's not really feasible to even try to raise queens unless you have a couple hundred hives or a lot of neighbors with bees. Ryan, in Ball Ground, in the past several years, there have been quite a number of beekeepers, and he's kind of in the middle of all of these different people. And he has done quite well at having queens that did have durability when they replaced a queen in the hive. I'm out at the edge of that, and everybody else in the area of Ball Ground is surrounding him, and so that puts them in a less ideal situation. But if a person doesn't have a plan for flooding the area with drones, it's very unlikely that they will have durable queens. Does that answer your question? Most of the guys down south that raise queens, we're talking thousands of hives. And
Do you graft, BJ?
Yeah. Yeah, we've got a $600 queen in a hive right now with 5 frames of brood. She's not for sale, by the way.
I knew that. Have you already started to graft, or are you going to wait till the drone brood starts coming up?
Well, we've got pretty good drone brood now, but my numbers are down, and I've got to get my numbers up. We moved our queen yard 200 miles from Cairo, Georgia, up to Butts County near Jackson, and so I've got to reestablish the drone yards. And grafting right now for me is not critical because I've got good queens that are available from Hawaii and California starting in early April.
So you order them, if you don't graft, you order them from a selective queen breeder.
To be able to sell queens to people, I need all the queens I can raise usually, and we might raise as many as 800 in the past years. Starting late this year, we won't do that many this year, but the critical thing for me is not queens this time of the year because I can buy good quality queens.
Yeah.
The critical time for me is after I medicate in August and making splits while the bees are on a late summer nectar flow and real strong, and getting my numbers as high as I can get them before I go into winter. Does that answer your question, Bo?
Yeah, it does. I'm just, I've heard more and more people going, rather than the grafting route, especially people with lower numbers of hives going to queen breeders. And I wasn't sure what you were doing since you had so many hives.
Yeah. People used to ask me, with all the money I spent buying queens, which could easily hit the $30,000 mark, why I didn't raise them. And my answer was always, why on earth would I sell you an experiment if I can buy the best queens that are out there?
Yeah.
And
the reason I'm asking is I'm finding that some queens are more, I don't know, maybe it's me, that are more resilient, more mite resistant. The hives are more, I mean, I've got some that the mites they take over, and then, it seems like the queens that aren't, they thrive, and those are the ones that have the good genetics to get the grafting, the cells from.
Most commercial production are very high in genetic rating. Our professor from Minnesota went to California years ago and they hired her to come and test for genetics in the hives. And it was impressive how well the genetics were showing up in those tests.
Okay.
There's different ways for the genetics to have and demonstrate hygienics. One is suppressive mite resistance, and that's where the bees can sense that the mites are reproducing, and they might abort those bees in order to kill the mites. You've got the leg biters, and that was an experiment through Purdue University, and you haven't heard much about it the last few years. The bees tended to be a lot more aggressive and just inconsistent results. You talk about the Russian bees. None of these are able to keep the mites low enough that you don't need to control them in the hive. Part of our problem here in Georgia is we've got such a long season that it's come to the point that if you're not doing something to reduce your mite load 2 times and then again, the major treatment would be in August, but you should be checking your mites in February to know if you have any mites and make it worth treating at least 6 weeks before the nectar flow begins. And the problem, it used to be years ago that we could let the mites go and the 1st of August treat, get control, and we were good until the next August. But the problem is the viruses. We used to be told that the viruses could not be transmitted from bee to bee, only from the mites. So you control the mites in the hive, and as the bees wear themselves out over the next month after the treatment is finished, you reduce your viruses. Well, word we have now is that the bees can actually transmit the viruses, but not as efficiently as the mites do. And of course, if you have a queen that has the virus, she is going to transmit the virus to every egg that she lays. Shannon caught most of these points, so I'm just reinforcing what she said, sometimes giving it a little more detail. Is there anything you didn't understand that you would like to have clarified?
BJ, just curiosity, on average, how many or how long does your queens last in your commercial hives? How often do you replace those?
There will be hives that might have 4 or 5 queens in 1 year, and that's not at the same time. And there will be others that might still have the queen from 2.5 years before.
Acid in November, or what exactly approach?
My treatment of choice is Apogard.
Apogard.
The thymol-based gel material.
Mm-hmm.
And
because I know that Apovar is not as effective as it once was, but I guess the Apogard is the way to go.
The great thing about Apovar is it has no detrimental effect on queens and hives that have been requeened. And so it doesn't affect the cluster. It doesn't drive the bees away from the strip. It works real well in the wintertime when you have a small amount of brood or a tight cluster with the bees on a limited number of frames, meaning less than 5 frames of brood. And so if someone came wanting to have a commercially produced treatment in February, Apovar is usually going to be the best. But to get that, you have to know what your mite count is and to know what's there. You could powder sugar sift them 4 or 5 times a day for 2 weeks, and your mites would be definitely dropped. Powder sugar sifting them twice a week, you'll have more mites at the end of the period than you did at the beginning. Anybody can ask questions. We've got there were a couple of, I thought there was something on the chat, but I don't see anything there now. You guys hear that computer voice, don't you? I'm sorry.
So, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
New beekeeper here, still waiting for my hive. How do you find out if you have other beekeepers in the 2-mile radius of you? Where's the best place to look for that?
Well, you could go buy a drone and have a camera on it and just scour every bush and tree and building, because they're often not visible even from the air. A couple of hives sitting next to a building or underneath a big oak tree would be pretty well invisible to see from the road or anywhere. Being a part of the bee club and talking to people, and especially people that know the beekeepers, is a good thing. Where do you live, Jillian?
I live in Woodstock off of Mill Creek Road by Arnold Mill and East Cherokee.
Mm-hmm. That kind of connects right up there to Johnston. Is it Johnston Elementary?
Yep, that's on the top.
And at the other end is River something school, right?
There's
River
a
Walk.
middle school and a high school down there. I don't have any kids, so I don't really care.
Right in the middle between schools.
Yeah.
Right off the top of my head, I don't remember anyone with an address in there. We don't really have a database locating everybody. A lot of times beekeepers don't want the Department of Ag to know where they are. Georgia people are just a little bit stubborn, and they don't even want anybody else to know how many hives they have. The biggest beekeeper in Georgia, I think the Sons are running it now, it would be the ADs in Mississippi. He never ever told anyone how many hives he had. He would use the number of 70,000, but that was not saying that was how many he had. Just some way in talking about it, he would answer the question and give kind of that general answer. But 70,000 hives of bees is a lot of bees.
Google Earth.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what I do too.
Richard was about 5'8", and he might have weighed 140 pounds. And he managed the operation with his 2 sons and quite a few helpers. These commercial guys that have 10, 12,000, 50,000 hives of bees, they might buy 15 or 20 artificially inseminated queens, or they might hire the specialist to inseminate their queens artificially. One of the advantages of an artificially inseminated queen is you genetically select. So you're selecting the drones that you're going to use, and you're selecting the queen stock. And so my friend Joe Latshaw, who has been our speaker different times at the club, is up in Ohio. He does not treat for mites. He doesn't use any antibiotics. He might do a oxalic sugar water drip in the wintertime. But he wants the bees to survive without that. And Ohio is such a short season, and maybe he's so isolated that he is not affected by anyone else's bee yards and picking up mites from them. Here in Georgia, you can get your hive 100% free of mites theoretically in August. And in October, if a tree or someone's beehive that they don't medicate gets real weak, your bees going in to rob the honey out of that hive could pick up mites and have a very severe infestation over a few days' time. More often is you don't do a mite drop test. You don't know whether your medication was effective or what percentage of control you achieved, and your mites rebound on their own. If you want to know how well you medicated, you have to do a mite test. And the best time to do that is not immediately at the end of the test. It would be wait a couple weeks later. Right at the end of the test, you've still got the effects of having the medication. And when I say medication, it doesn't have to be chemical. Bo was asking about Apivar earlier. Apivar is Amitraz. It's an ag chemical. It has a very short life as opposed to the organophosphates. Am I talking too much? Okay. Sometimes we will use what's the acid I use, Ryan? Formic. Sometimes I use formic acid. And the reason I would use formic acid is I can't put a new queen in a hive for at least 2 weeks after Apiguard is finished and removed from the hive. The residual odor in there overwhelms the pheromones of a new queen, interferes with her acceptance. A lot of beginners want to paint their queens. You never ever paint a queen until she's got 2 or 3 frames of eggs. She is not accepted fully until she is established and laying well in the hive. And I've known people that they get one of these buffs or they do something and they want to paint their queen. The wind's just coming up real strong outside. They want to paint their queen before they install their package. And maybe if they put her back in the cage and leave her in the cage for a few days, it might work. But when they're releasing the queen from the cage after the package has been in the hive for 3 days, the chances that she will be destroyed are greatly increased.
I'm going to throw a question out that I've gotten on email several times. And that is, should I go ahead and treat if my hive is not queen right? Or should I make it queen right, get it queen right before I treat? And the answer I've always given is make sure your hive is queen right, delay treatment until you get it queen right, because the bees will have no reason to stay if you put, a chemical in there that is obtuse, and they don't like the smell of it if they have no brood to hang around. So can you shed some light on that?
Sure. You're asking me, right? To shed light on it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, that's the answer that I've given. That's my opinion, obviously. That you always want your
part of the explanation is when you don't have a queen and you don't have brood, you don't have any cohesiveness in the cluster. You don't have any concentration, and your mites are completely focused on the brood. If you have mites up in the honey super, it's because they're riding on one of the bees that's up there. And but the density of mites is absolutely in the cluster. We know this because you can do a powdered sugar sift over the cluster and wait an hour and count the mites that are on the board down below. You don't even have to make it sticky, but your mites are always going to be focused underneath that globe shape of a cluster. But the scientists know it too, but I'm just saying this is a way that you can see it yourself and not have any doubts. What else did you want me to answer on that, Ryan?
Oh, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure, that you agree that a hive should always be queen right and have brood in it before you treat. Because,
Yeah,
a beekeeper, if they've got 10 hives, they're going to want to treat them all at the same time. So it's easier to remember when you started and how many treatments they've had and so on and so forth. But the best thing for the bees, like you said, cohesiveness is to have brood and a queen right hive before you
right.
treat.
If I had a hive that I chose not to stack, but to repair, and it was time to medicate, I would not use Apogard in it. I would use Apivar, but I would give it 3 or 4 frames of brood and a couple of pounds of bees and get it off to a strong start. You can't afford to have, a pound of bees in a box and expect them to keep the wax moths out and to build up rapidly and get healthy for the winter. So it's difficult to get mite control on a hive that is not queen right. That means a queen laying, not one that's in there and not laying. Got to have a healthy situation. The other side of that is you don't want to put a good queen in a hive that's full of mites. So a repair like I was just talking about should be a situation where you have maybe you have a couple of hives that are double brood, and basically you're doing away with the one and splitting another one to replace it. You still keep your numbers, but you're not really repairing that hive that's in trouble.
I have a question, BJ.
Good.
So a queen, when she's a good, healthy queen, she's laying a great pattern of brood. And then I had a queen who started doing the drone laying, but it seemed as though she was failing and she wasn't making the nice pattern of brood. It was kind of, she'd make a patch of brood here, a patch of brood there. It could be anywhere on the frame and about the size of, let's say, a softball. And I thought that it was because they were going into winter and she was kind of slowing down in the fall, that maybe that was the reason for that. But apparently she was running out of viable sperm, and then she eventually became a drone layer. So is that, if you see that kind of laying pattern in the fall where it's just patches here and there and softball size patches, is that kind of an indicator that I need to start thinking about replacing her right away?
Well, your first question is mites. And your second question is, when did you treat to get control of the mites? Could you still have viruses? And when you medicate, you want as much brood as you can get and a high activity level. So if there's no nectar flow, if you're not feeding them a quart a week for a couple of weeks at least before you medicate and during the medication, your activity level can be greatly diminished and your effectiveness of your treatment that much less also. But yeah, you've just got to see everything in the hive to be able to evaluate and identify possible problems and then narrow them down. It's very difficult to have a hive with a softball sized cluster in September, October, and expect it to be alive through the winter. Another thing there is if you have a small cluster and they can't access food because of cold, they can't break out of the cluster, and they can't keep the queen warm, semen loses a viability quite frequently if the queen gets down in the area of 37 degrees. That's not a precise or an exact thing, but it is known. When you have a cluster that size, they can't bring the food into the cluster as well. And if they don't have food in their stomachs and the mass of bees, they can't function. And sometimes you might even have the queen die and them replace her. Anything goes wrong in the hive, it's the queen's fault. You know that, right? And when they blame the queen for problems that they're having, they will often replace her. An example of that that doesn't really relate to mites is if Ryan goes in the same hive and pulls a frame or two of brood every 7 to 10 days, after 2 or 3 cycles of that, they're going to say, hey, there's a problem and it's all her fault, and they're going to make supersedure cells. She can be a perfectly good queen, but management has demonstrated that the hive has a problem. Everybody's very serious.
So I want to mention something, if it's okay, BJ. It's just
Sure.
my observations over, I guess in going into my 19th year of beekeeping, 18, 19th, and is that a lot of beekeepers, you know, back 20 years ago, queens were only $15 a piece. Then they went up, 18, 20, now they're what, $30, $35 a piece. And it seems expensive, but it's a heck of a lot cheaper to replace a queen that is not performing correctly, not laying a good brood pattern, not producing the amount of brood that you need to collect honey and nectar and feed the hive, than it is to just let her go and just hope that she gets better. I've also seen that a queen can have bad genetics, and she has brood that's volatile, and they like to sting. They're a little meaner. You know what I'm talking about. And they choose to keep those queens too long. And it's just you don't want to keep a queen too long just thinking that she's going to get better, because they never get better. They just stop laying, they stop producing, or their brood gets so mean that you just dread going in your bees. And it can actually turn other hives mean. I've seen that happen myself.
Yeah, when a hive gets real aggressive, the pheromone is in the air. We can't smell it, but it definitely makes the hives around it more aggressive, defensive. You have to walk away from it or run, one of the two. Did any of you have any questions on the inbreeding comments in the video? Have any of you ever seen drones with ivory colored eyes they're blind?
I've seen pictures of it, not in my own.
I had that occur maybe 20, 25 years ago. But one time I asked Joe about that regarding having breeder queens. If we needed to have, drone yards set up with, a separate different genetics to keep from having a problem. And Joe kind of smiles and says, and realize Joe's probably 37 years old and I'm 67. He treats me very kindly. But he says, no, we've got such a diverse source of drones and genetics, and we've got the diversity in the queens as well. You won't have any problem. with your genetics, unless you're in a closed situation where you're saving your own genetics every year and breeding from your genetics. I've known people that had 2,500 hives and they were raising queens and they weren't doing very well. And as we talked about it, he would say, well, this guy lives this far away, this direction, and we've got bee yards here, here, and here. And there's a lot of bees out there. And my comment was, well, which direction is the queen flying? And we both laughed and said, well, we can't really know that, can we? And that's why, to do a good job, you can't afford to put limited, less than ideal yards to supply drones. A beehive to supply drones has to be real strong, and maybe even supply some drone brood in the hive. If you want to have a lot of drones in your hive, one of the techniques of keeping your mites lower would be drone frames. Now, these are plastic frames or wax frames that the pattern is for drone cells, which are larger. And the idea is you get this frame drawn one year, and through the winter, you move it out to the edge. And when you get up to 4, 5, 6 frames of brood, you drop it right in the middle of the cluster, and the queen should pretty well fill that frame up over a day or two's time, which puts them all in near the same cycle. The value of that is the mite goes into that larva just as it's getting ready to go into pupation and get sealed up. And so when they're all sealed up, the mites are in those cells and they're captive. Well, you pull that frame out, you put it in the freezer for several days or a week, and you take it out, you break the caps, let it thaw out. Breaking the caps when it's frozen, you're not going to damage the comb. You're able to drag it across the caps, and once that cap is damaged, the bees will remove the dead brood and do it quickly, especially if there are good hygienic bees. You could test your hygienics that way too, see. If a person had 4 hives, this is easy to do with single brood chamber hives. If you have 4 frames, you have 2 in the hive at any one time and 2 in the freezer. And so 2 hives have the frames in them. You take those 2 frames out, you take frames from the hives that don't have, whether it's an empty frame or a brood frame, and you put it in the hole in the hive that you removed the drone frame that's sealed up. And then you take the frames from the freezer that you've thawed out and you drop them in the hives that haven't had a drone frame in them. So you're just kind of doing a rotation, and whether you do it once a week or once a month, this is an extremely good method to control your mites in the springtime. Rarely is it done though. If you do double brood chamber hives, you can afford to put one in and keep one in there all the time, but you really don't want to dedicate that space to a drone frame if you only have a single brood chamber. Surely someone's got a question. You do understand the difference between supersedure and swarm queens? If your bees raise a queen in their hive, now we're not talking about mating at all, but your hive raises a queen, which queen is going to be the better queen, a supersedure queen or a swarm queen?
Supersedure.
Why?
Because if they're wanting to swarm, they're going to create multiple queens. They're going to create them very quickly because they think they're overcrowded, and they're not going to develop well.
Okay, the other side of that, you know, devil's advocate thing, the supersedure queen is not rushed. She is not put through the process at an expedited rate. The supersedure queen, did I say supersedure on that one? The swarm queen is not rushed. The supersedure queen, on the other hand, may not be started until day 5. And so she's not going to have as much royal jelly at an early date as the swarm queen. So how can you tell the difference between a supersedure queen and a swarm queen?
Size?
No. It could show you. If it doesn't get enough royal jelly, and nutrition in insects determine size to a great deal. So if she's hurt on her nutrition and diet in her larva and pupa stages, it will affect size. A supersedure queen is a queen that the egg was meant to be a worker and was converted. It was changed to become a queen. A swarm queen is a queen cup to start with, and the egg is placed in the queen cup. So for the first year beekeeper, it's probably hard to distinguish, but it's the kind of thing that to practice it, practice observing and understanding the patterns, you begin to realize. And a supersedure queen typically is going to be in a nice fertile brood pattern, and that worker cell is going to be drawn out, enlarged, and turned down over the top of other cells. And so it caps over the caps of several workers, and they can't hatch. You see a distortion in the cells after the fact. A nice worker brood pattern, and all of a sudden here's just a distorted pattern for a couple of cells. Delaplane said years ago that the best queens are raised during the swarm impulse. Large amounts of royal jelly, and they're doing it on purpose. The confusing part is this, is if the bees swarm, when they swarm, all of the cells are pretty much the same stage. But after that queen's gone, they take young larvae and make supersedure cells also. And so if you don't cut those supersedure cells after the swarm, you're going to have a second swarm that could take place about 10 days later. So when the beginner looks at his hive and it's swarmed and sees all these supersedure cells, he said, well, that queen must not have been any good. No, the swarm queen was great. It's these supersedure cells that were made after she left that created a problem. Am I telling you things you don't know? Am I telling you too much? It's probably time to finish. Nobody's had any great questions. We love to have your questions. And if you go to the website, you can always put your questions in, ask the professor. You may not get an answer in 5 minutes like you would on Facebook, but I'm sure your answer on Ask the Professor would have a better quality and more consistent quality than it would on Facebook. So use that feature. And we're going to close the meeting down as far as the program and the questioning. We've got a couple of questions that I've got to ask you, and we can't really have a business meeting because we don't really have a quorum. But Ryan, what's the prediction as far as the ability to have a summer picnic workshop?
Well, you know, it changes by the day, BJ, with the amount of people getting vaccinated and, you know, different variants of the COVID virus popping up. And, right now they've still got limits on the amount that can gather, outside of a family group. So, if everything goes as well as they think it will by, June, July timeframe, then it's a possibility, but there are still prohibitions put in place to prevent it at this time.
So there's really two options. One, do small group workshops. The advantage of doing it in July is hands-on understanding of the mite tests, the treatments, and to actually see in front of you the different things. Traditionally, our summer workshop has been a family gathering. If we're having to wear masks and keep minimal numbers, you cannot do it as a family gathering, and probably just do a workshop and not even do a picnic, right? What we've got to know from the group is, do you feel this is a very valuable and important thing for us to do, if at all possible? Or what's your thoughts? And we don't really have to have verbal answers right now, but it'd be great if you contacted Shannon, Ryan, myself, and voice your opinions. We used to have in excess of 100 people at our summer event, and do a big kind of a potluck with the club providing the meat and the tableware, and everybody bring a dish. And it was quite an event. But it's always a lot of fun to meet the families of the different people. All right, Shannon, do you have an announcement for us yet, as far as talking about families? And I heard a rumor that you might have a ring on your finger, or that
Oh,
kind
good
of a
Lord.
direction. What now?
Oh, yes. I'm going to be getting married soon. I don't have an exact date yet, trying to plan around COVID, but yes, very excited. Thank you.
We'll expect you to share that with us, because we would love to be able to share that excitement.
Definitely will. Thank you.
Anna gave me that information. So if you're,
I know.
it doesn't look
I
like
know who
you-
did it.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that with us, and it's nice to let everybody else know too. Other than talking about the summer picnic, what we'll do if we decide to do a workshop, we just need to have some general guidelines of what the club would like to have happen, and we'll put a committee together. But if we're going to do, the bigger the event is, the more important it is to start planning on it right away. And you get down to May, and if you haven't got even workshops planned for July, 2 months lead time, the communication and letting people know about the things, they become less effective. So the best thing in my mind is go to the effort and time to plan it. That way you're ready if you can do it. And we would have to have volunteers to do different things in the workshops. And
just my thought, BJ, I do think that we should probably, just my personal opinion, forego the food portion of the summer picnic for this year. We can always bring it back next year, but if we're going to plan something out, do small breakout sessions. We can request that people wear masks, while they're gathered around a hive, and just try to prevent. We do have some older folks in our club. We've got young folks, and we don't want anybody getting sick because they're learning about bees. So just take proper precautions and, plan to go forward with it. Hopefully the virus is looking better. There was a spike in like 14 states as of yesterday and today. but there's some different variants going around. But I do think it's going to be better by that time frame,
Time frame
or
being July.
June, July time frame, probably by July.
With the mite treatment being important to start early August, as near the 1st of August as possible, that's why July is about as long as we can wait in order to give guidance for medications for this year.
The other option that, I brought up is potentially to do, if people don't feel comfortable convening together, to do, Zoom presentations, kind of like we're doing now, but we have somebody videotaping like you in the hive while we're on a Zoom call and answering live questions. So, I mean, that could definitely take the place of that get together.
Okay.
I know, I feel like June, July is a good target, especially for an outdoor event. And like you said, is if you're uncomfortable, you can always wear a mask and we can distance a little bit. But it just, I think it is, we are definitely seeing a lot of vaccines right now and things are starting to open up. So I would totally support that. And I would be willing to help as well. So.
Okay. I know Bill quite well. Some of you don't get to see him very often. You may not even know who Bill Manus is, but I do. Okay. Is there anyone that would like to be in charge of a committee and try to come up with a plan?
Do you have a location in mind?
If we're doing a small breakout group, most likely it would be at someone's bee yard. If we were doing a big event, we would do it at the Moose. When I did the hands-on for the class that we did in January, we did 3 separate events so we could keep the numbers of people small. And it's the kind of thing that I guess the YouTube thing or the video, it could be done simultaneously at multiple locations. But the biggest thing on an event like this, you have several things that have to be presented that relate to different pests, medications, diseases. And I guess without the big group, you can go a whole lot faster than you would with a big group. How many of you have been to a summer workshop with the Cherokee Beekeepers Club? Right.
One.
Okay, Bill, Ryan, and I, and Bernadette. I was talking to a new beekeeper at Woodstock the other day, and he was up picking up some supplies. He was at bee school when we did it at the old courthouse, probably the last time, and there were about 140 beginners in attendance that day. 140 may have included the workers, may have been a dozen workers, but that was an incredible bee school. A lot of excitement. Okay.
Yeah, so I
you can do something here, BJ.
Go ahead, Bill.
I was say I'm willing to serve on a committee. If you need someone to head a committee, I can try that too. I just don't keep my bees at a friend's farm, so I'm not sure. I just have to talk to them about having people over there.
Yeah, we would need to keep our location in Cherokee County.
Yeah, this is right on the edge.
Oh, okay.
Right on the near County Line Road.
Okay.
You can do it here again, BJ, if you need to.
And Steve's down in Arnold Mill. If he doesn't have that now, he's probably going to have 12 or 14 hives real soon, right?
I got 11 right now.
Okay.
It should be close to maybe June 20.
Okay,
But
we'll
you're welcome
work
if
on
you
that.
need it here.
And
So BJ, that was kind of my point. If we did small little groups, you could have 6 to 8 people around a hive. You could do, kind of like we did at the bee school at the old courthouse, when we had breakout groups, and we could kind of reinvent that for summer with summer topics. That's kind of what I was getting at.
we'll do a mailing out to the whole club, and we'll try and get a committee of 5 or 6 people and have these people be the key people in presenting some of these things. Do some brainstorming, have some new faces, and not just have me up front. I'd like to make other people the stars. We want to thank Shannon for being the star of our show tonight. You didn't get to see her in the video, but she was there. That was her voice. And she gave us some really good information, and we thank her greatly for that.
Thank
So
you.
we're going to close the meeting, and we will see you next month. The program next month it's April. I think we're going to be following up on package B installation and some YouTubes and videos. Any last comments? Any questions? We've been asking for questions for an hour now, haven't we? Close. Okay, meeting's over. Thank you.
Thank you, BJ. Thanks for help, Ryan.
Thank you.